It began not with an explosion, not with a roar of cannons, but with a whisper in the corridors of Brussels. A whisper so faint it might have been ignored, yet within it lay the weight of an empire's design. In those closed chambers, decisions were made not with the voice of partnership, but with the cold arithmetic of control. Africa was not invited to the table. Africa was placed on the menu, but beloved history has a way of turning whispers into thunder. For what was meant to be secret would soon echo across continents. A single page slipped into the hands of a journalist would set fire to the conscience of nations. And from that fire, a question rises. How long can a person kneel before they decide to stand? Stay with me, my friends, because what you are about to hear is not just a story of politics. It is a story of dignity, of sovereignty, of a continent finding its voice. And before we step deeper into this journey, I invite you, subscribe to this channel, share this message, and walk with us as we uncover the truth the world was never meant to hear. It all began behind locked doors in Brussels, the kind of room where curtains are drawn tight, where words are spoken in hushed tones, where power is not declared but quietly enforced. In that room, Washington pressed its allies with a chilling command: raise tariffs on Africa, strangle its oil and gold, force it to crawl back into dependency. Donald Trump stood as the voice of that command. His words carried the weight of economic threat. He did not speak of partnership, he spoke of punishment. Oil and gold, the twin lifelines of Africa, were named as targets. Without them, he said, Africa would buckle. And if Africa buckled, Washington's grip on global order would hold firm. Most European leaders bowed their heads, some out of fear, others out of calculation, but not all. For in that room sat a conscience, too restless to remain silent. A single page from a classified memo slipped away in the dead of night. It did not travel through official channels. It did not bear a seal of power. Instead, it found its way into the hands of an anonymous journalist, a messenger who chose integrity over ambition. And when that journalist's report reached the light of day, it struck like lightning. The headline was short, the message explosive. Washington had pushed Europe to prepare tariffs designed to choke Africa's oil and gold. What had been whispered in Brussels now thundered across the airwaves. In capitals from Lagos to Kinshasa, from Bamako to Ouagadougou, the reaction was swift. Ordinary people asked the same question: how long will we let them dictate our future? In markets and in schools, on radios and on social media, the fire spread. This was no rumor. This was confirmation of what many had long suspected. Economic warfare dressed as diplomacy. And in Ouagadougou, a soldier turned statesman did not hesitate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read the leak not as speculation, but as declaration. Standing before his advisers before dawn, he cut through the silence with words that would frame a movement. This is not about tariffs. This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, our sovereignty. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow. By midday, his message had become a summons. Calls went out across the Sahel. Leaders from Mali, Guinea, and beyond were urged to gather, not in Geneva, not in Paris, but in the heart of Africa itself. And within days, a secret summit was underway. Behind heavy doors, in a room thick with defiance, the leaders of the Sahel spoke not as petitioners, but as partners in resistance. They recounted decades of silent plunder, gold siphoned through shadow contracts, oil fields dominated by foreign firms, revenues shipped overseas, while villages remained in poverty. For the first time in living memory, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about aid, no longer about loans, no longer about bending to the conditions of others. It was about standing together. And then came the moment of decision. Captain Traoré, his voice steady, laid down a line that could not be erased. If they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets, and we will find new partners who respect us. The room fell silent. Eyes searched one another. The risk was immense. To cut off oil and gold was to invite hardship. But one by one, the leaders nodded. The fracture lines of the continent began to converge into a single, unyielding answer. Word of the summit's decision spread quickly, not through official statements, but through the voices of ordinary people. Radio stations echoed fragments of speeches. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou's Independence Square. Young students raised placards. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. And so, what began as a whisper in Brussels had become a chorus across Africa. Yet the world beyond had not yet felt the tremor of this decision. That shockwave was still to come. For in Europe's markets, in America's corridors of power, and in the offices of NATO itself, the reaction would be nothing short of a reckoning. The decision of the Sahel summit was not kept behind closed doors for long. What began in whispers of solidarity soon thundered in declarations. The leaders of Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and their allies stood together and declared, if Europe imposed tariffs on Africa's lifeblood, Africa would close the valve itself. Oil and gold would not flow without dignity. This was no empty threat. Within hours, the airwaves carried the message. Markets trembled. Traders in Frankfurt and Paris watched screens flash red. Gold prices soared like rockets breaking through clouds. Refineries in the Mediterranean realized that their daily lifeline, oil drawn from the Sahel, could be gone overnight. Energy planners in Paris whispered of the unthinkable. More than half of the uranium that powered France's nuclear grid came from Niger. Without it, lights across the country could dim. In Milan, executives of the electric car industry sat pale-faced in emergency sessions. Without cobalt and lithium from Congo, their vision of a green revolution was no more than smoke. And in London, commentators who once dismissed Africa as a mere supplier now began to ask, have we underestimated the continent's power? But the most dramatic image was not in Europe, it was in Ouagadougou. One evening, television screens flickered as Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared before his nation. He did not stand flanked by generals in gleaming medals. He stood shoulder to shoulder with miners still dusted in gold, farmers with calloused hands, engineers in worn jackets. This was not the image of a distant elite. This was the face of Africa itself. His words were plain, unpolished, yet carved into the memory of a generation. They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity. The streets erupted. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight of oil barrels wrapped in African flags. In Bamako, voices sang of sovereignty as though it were a new anthem. In Kinshasa, marketplaces buzzed, not with fear, but with fire. Across social media, young Africans shared a single phrase: if Traoré stands, we stand. The shock in Europe was immediate and undeniable. The dependency once hidden in balance sheets, was suddenly visible to the world. Their industries, their grids, their banks, so much of it was tethered to African soil. And now Africa had seized the cord. Washington, however, did not flinch. Donald Trump thundered at rallies, his voice carried across oceans. Africa will crawl back. Once their treasuries run dry, they will beg at our feet. His words drew cheers from his crowds, but in diplomatic halls they rang with arrogance. To many beyond the West, it sounded less like strength and more like desperation. For as America bellowed, another movement stirred in silence. In Beijing, trade officials opened emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks. In Moscow, delegations proposed joint ventures in oil and gold, promising barrels and bullion would flow under new Eurasian flags. In New Delhi, perhaps the boldest gesture came. Long-term agreements to purchase Sahelian crude, no matter what Europe declared. One by one, the BRICS nations signaled that Africa would not stand alone. And so the stage was set. Europe panicked, America threatened, Africa stood firm, and BRICS extended their hands. Yet the true counterattack was still waiting in the wings. For the retaliation that came next did not arrive with tanks or missiles. It came quietly, cloaked in finance, in banks, in digital shadows. And it would test Africa's resolve in ways no battlefield ever could. The counterstrike did not come with boots on the ground. It came through the invisible hands of finance and technology. Within days of the Sahel's defiance, European banks began freezing accounts tied to African state companies. Cargo ships, heavy with oil and gold, were halted in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork under review. Insurance firms in London and Paris refused to cover African exports. Without coverage, shipments could not move. Then came the digital assault. Shadows moved through cyberspace. Government servers in Ouagadougou and Bamako flickered and fell. Financial transfers froze midstream. Websites collapsed. Anonymous cyber units probed for weaknesses, seeking to choke the arteries of a new African independence before it could find its rhythm. On television screens across Europe, coordinated media campaigns painted Captain Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, a populist strongman dragging his people into ruin. Editorials warned of a hunger, of chaos, of ordinary Africans rising against their leaders. The message was clear: hardship would break the continent. And yes, hardship came. Prices rose in markets. Medicines became harder to find. Parents worried over school fees. Farmers wondered if their harvests would rot without buyers. For a moment, it seemed as though the strategy might succeed. But then something unexpected stirred. Rather than fracture, communities closed ranks. Volunteers distributed food in villages. Students built solidarity networks to keep schools alive. Farmers pooled their resources, ensuring crops reached local markets even without foreign buyers. What was meant to divide was instead binding the people together. At an emergency meeting of the Alliance of Sahel States, Traoré's words rang out: "They are trying to turn our people against us. They believe hardship will break us." But hardship is not new to Africa. What is new is our refusal to kneel. The response was swift and deliberate. Joint security forces began escorting resource convoys. Local banks launched gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western transfers. Engineers in Mali and Niger worked through the night to stabilize power grids. Burkina Faso announced a national reserve fund, stocked with oil and gold revenues, designed to shield citizens from the sharpest shocks. These were not desperate acts. They were signals of resilience. Africa was learning to walk on its own feet, step by step, even under fire. And each failed attempt to fracture the continent only strengthened its bonds. In the streets of Ouagadougou, a young student carried a hand-painted sign, "Better to suffer with dignity than live on our knees." The crowd erupted, not in despair, but in agreement. The message spread across borders, across radio waves, across social media feeds. A continent once portrayed as dependent now looked defiant, unbroken. And just as Europe believed Africa was tightening under its grip, a new revelation surfaced, one more explosive than the first leak. From the shadows emerged another set of documents, contracts drafted long before the tariff dispute was made public. They told of oil fields quietly promised to foreign firms for half a century, of gold mines funneled directly into offshore accounts. This was not about tariffs at all. It was about permanent control, and when this truth came to light, it would ignite a firestorm far greater than any embargo. The mask had fallen, and the world was about to see the face beneath. Do you believe Africa can truly break free from these hidden chains, or will new powers simply replace the old ones? Share your thoughts below. In Washington, the strategy was clear. Drown defiance in the flood of propaganda. Donald Trump stood on podiums and thundered to crowds that Captain Ibrahim Traoré was reckless, a reckless populist dragging Africa into ruin. He painted the crisis not as a clash of sovereignty, but as a test of Western dominance. His crowds cheered, waving flags, chanting promises of supremacy. Yet abroad, diplomats heard something different. They heard desperation in the voice of the empire. They heard the cracking of a global order that had long taken Africa for granted. In Europe, divisions widened. Some ministers followed Washington's line, insisting on sanctions and financial restrictions. Yet graphs and charts on their desks told another story. Refineries stalling, bullion markets trembling, cobalt contracts slipping into Chinese hands. A German minister whispered what others dared not. Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves. Opposition parties pounced on the crisis. In Berlin, lawmakers asked why ordinary workers should pay for a tariff war against Africa. In Paris, unions warned of layoffs if gold supplies dried up. In London, late-night commentators posed the unthinkable question: have we underestimated Africa's power? The silence that followed was louder than applause. Meanwhile, beyond the West, the narrative took a different shape. In South America, activists drew parallels between Africa's stand and their own struggles against resource exploitation. In Asia, commentators hailed the defiance as a new axis of dignity. And across the diaspora, from Paris to New York, African voices rang with pride. Protesters marched with banners. No more hidden chains. For once, the story of Africa was not one of dependency. It was one of leadership. The harder the West tried to isolate Africa, the more the continent appeared not as a rebel, but as a pioneer. Images of Traoré standing with miners, farmers, and engineers resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. They became symbols of sovereignty itself, proof that resistance could be rooted in dignity rather than despair. And just as Europe thought the storm might calm, another thunderclap struck. A second leak surfaced, this time revealing secret contracts signed in back rooms that threatened to expose the depth of Western designs on Africa's wealth. And when these documents came to light, outrage would sweep the continent like wildfire, turning hardship into resolve and silence into roar. The second leak fell like thunder across the continent. This time, it was not about tariffs, nor whispers of economic warfare. It was about theft, planned, polished, and prepared long before the first sanctions were even spoken. The documents revealed contracts drafted in secret, promising Africa's lifeblood to foreign hands for generations to come. Oil reserves in Niger leased for 50 years at cut-rate prices. Gold from Burkina Faso funneled directly into offshore accounts, bypassing African treasuries entirely. The language was blunt, the signatures undeniable. Outrage swept across Africa. In Bamako, crowds stormed foreign offices demanding accountability. In Ouagadougou, banners filled the streets. No more hidden chains. In Kinshasa and Lagos, protesters chanted for sovereignty, their voices carried not by leaders, but by the people themselves. Traoré seized the moment. Standing before a hall of parliamentarians, he declared, with measured fire, "They wanted to steal not just our oil and gold, but our future. If we allow this, then every sacrifice our people have endured is meaningless. But if we resist, then their theft becomes our rebirth." The chamber erupted in applause, and beyond its walls, momentum surged. The Alliance of Sahel States announced a joint investigation into every foreign contract signed in the last 2 decades. Protesters across Africa demanded transparency from corporations long shielded by secrecy. Even diaspora communities in Paris and New York rallied, pressing Western firms for answers. For decades, Africa had been forced to react, begging for aid, scrambling under sanctions, adjusting to rules set elsewhere. Now, for the first time, the continent was writing its own rules. Oil and gold were no longer tokens of dependency. They had become symbols of dignity, rallying cries for sovereignty. From whispers in Brussels to roars in Ouagadougou, Africa had shifted the balance. The embargo meant to fracture had instead forged unity. The contracts meant to bind had instead awakened resolve. And the leaders of AES understood. The struggle was no longer about survival. It was about a future that belonged to Africa alone. But as Africa stood taller, one question remained. Was the world ready to meet the continent, not as a marketplace, but as an equal? It began with a whisper, a single page slipping from the shadows of Brussels. It rose into a chorus in the streets of Ouagadougou, and it thundered into a storm that shook the halls of NATO, unsettled the markets of Europe, and exposed the hidden chains of dependency. Yes, there was anger. Anger at the arrogance of those who believed Africa could be strangled into submission. Anger at the contracts drafted in secret, designed to steal futures unborn. Yes, there was sorrow. Sorrow for the families who felt the sting of higher prices, for the mothers who worried over medicine, for the students who wondered how long their schools could endure. But above all, there was hope. Hope in the defiance of a continent that had long been underestimated. Hope in the voices that rose not in despair, but in dignity. Hope that for once, Africa was not kneeling, but standing. This is more than politics. This is a turning of the tide. Oil and gold, once symbols of plunder, have become emblems of pride. And in that pride, Africa has found its strength. So when you read the headlines, when you hear the debates, remember, Ibrahim Traoré news is not only about one man. It is about a people declaring that their sovereignty is not for sale. And when you follow Burkina Faso news, remember it is not merely about one nation, but about a continent choosing to write its own destiny. If you believe dignity is worth more than gold, then stand with us. Comment below, share this story, and let your voice be part of this chorus. And before you go, let me remind you, subscribe to this channel, because this struggle is far from over, and history is still being written. The next chapter is coming, and together we will be here to witness it. For from whispers to thunder, Africa has spoken. The question is no longer whether the world will hear, but whether it is ready to listen.